Imagine serving a king not by delivering food or fighting on the battlefield, but by cleaning up after his most intimate, grotesque moments. What if your path to power involved attending to a monarch's bodily functions? Step into the dark, cold stone corridors of a medieval castle. The smell of stale sweat and damp earth fills the air. In the corner of the royal chamber stands a figure most would never notice, a servant covered in grime, awaiting the king's call. Their job? To perform the most repulsive duties imaginable, tending to the king's personal needs in ways that no one else dared. But how did someone rise to such an intimate position? And more importantly, what risks awaited those who served so close to the throne? For many, the price of power was far greater than the dirt they cleaned up. In medieval England, this disturbing reality wasn't just the stuff of nightmares. It was the daily life of royal servants like the Groom of the Stool. And strangely enough, the more revolting the task, the closer they became to true influence. In a medieval world where hierarchy ruled and power was everything, positions like the Groom of the Stool emerged from these grim realities. From dirt to influence, the dark path to power. Life for a poor peasant in medieval times was a constant struggle for survival. Every day was a battle against hunger, disease, and the harsh realities of a rigid class system that offered little hope of upward mobility. Most peasants lived in small, overcrowded homes made of wattle and daub, sharing their space with livestock to keep warm during the cold months. Their days were spent toiling in the fields, working the land for a lord whose wealth and power were so far removed from their own lives that it seemed almost mythical. Opportunities to escape this brutal cycle of poverty were rare. For many, the dream of rising beyond their station was just that, a dream. The class system of medieval society was unforgiving. Peasants were born into poverty, and the vast majority died in it. The hope of ever entering the royal court, let alone wielding any influence there, was laughable to most. Yet for a select few, a chance did exist, though it came in the most degrading and unimaginable form. Some of the most ambitious peasants found themselves in the royal household, not as nobles or knights, but as lowly servants. They entered through the back doors of castles and palaces, often unseen and unappreciated by the nobility. Their tasks were humiliating, their days filled with the kind of labor no one else would perform, but for those who took on the dirtiest jobs, there was one thing they could gain: proximity to the king, and with proximity came opportunity. The servant's main duty was to clean up after the king used the toilet, or in those days, the chamber pot. The job was anything but glamorous, and absolutely revolting. But this role wasn't just about filth. It was about trust. Only someone deeply trusted could be present in such vulnerable private moments. And that trust gave these servants a power most nobles would envy. Now imagine the paradox of such a role. The servant literally cleaned up after the king, managing his waste, yet was also privy to his secrets, his confidential conversations, and perhaps even the whispers of betrayal and political maneuvering. It may seem baffling to us today, but the king relied on the Groom of the Stool not just for hygiene, but for discretion and counsel. In the medieval court, where power games were as cutthroat as they were secretive, access to the king meant influence. And those who held this role were closer than anyone else. But with such power comes great risk. The political landscape of the court was dangerous, and those who got too close to the king often found themselves caught in the crossfire of rival factions or betrayed by those jealous of their influence. The court was a political battlefield where influence was hard-won and constantly volatile. Nobles, courtiers, and advisors all jockeyed for favor, using flattery, cunning, and sometimes betrayal to get closer to the seat of power. Yet while public displays of loyalty and influence could be fleeting, those who had direct access to the king in private wielded a more dangerous kind of power, one built on trust, secrecy, and intimacy. The Groom of the Stool, despite his lowly title, held a position closer to the king than most high-ranking nobles. He saw the monarch in his most vulnerable state, during secluded, personal moments when the royal mask slipped away. In these intimate moments, the king might speak freely about matters of state, his personal concerns, or even court intrigues. For the groom, this was a double-edged sword. It offered unparalleled access to the king's thoughts and secrets, but it also placed him in the middle of court politics, where any misstep could be fatal. The political dynamics of medieval courts were notoriously treacherous. Rival factions within the court constantly vied for the king's ear, and any servant or courtier with direct access to the monarch became a key player in these power struggles. The Groom of the Stool was no exception. While nobles might only see the king in formal settings, the groom was with him daily, overseeing not just his hygiene but also his personal needs, and sometimes even managing secretive correspondence. This constant behind-the-scenes presence allowed the groom to influence decisions subtly, often acting as a gatekeeper who controlled who could approach the king and when. The nature of this influence was often hidden from view. While nobles might make grand public gestures, the groom's power lay in the quiet moments behind closed doors, where he could offer advice, provide information, or help manage the king's day-to-day life. For a king like Henry VIII, known for his erratic loyalties and tempestuous relationships, having a servant he trusted with his deepest secrets made the Groom of the Stool more influential than many of the nobles who publicly vied for favor. The disturbing role and medieval filth. The position of Groom of the Stool involved more than just the indignity of tending to the king's most private needs. It also meant working in a world where plumbing was either non-existent or incredibly primitive. Unlike modern times, where we can enjoy the convenience of modern plumbing, in medieval times, castles were not the sanitary fortresses we imagine today. The plumbing, if it existed at all, was rudimentary at best. Most castles didn't have the indulgence of built-in toilets, and waste management was a messy, grueling affair. While some royal palaces, like the Tower of London, eventually installed garderobes, essentially small rooms that contained a stone or wooden seat with a hole leading to a cesspit, these early toilets still required frequent and filthy manual cleaning. The waste didn't disappear. It simply fell into pits, moats, or nearby rivers. The smell was overwhelming, and the task of clearing it was left to the lowest-ranking servants. The Groom of the Stool's job didn't just involve dealing with the king's excrement, but also managing the primitive disposal systems in place. Waste was usually carried away in buckets and dumped far from the castle walls. Imagine the stench, the sheer physical labor, and the humiliation of carrying the waste through the halls of the palace. The job was not just disgusting, it was dangerous, as these servants risked exposure to disease and contamination every day. To make matters worse, the knowledge of basic hygiene was virtually non-existent. In a world where sanitation practices were poor and hand-washing was not yet a recognized necessity, the risks were even greater. Medieval medical understanding didn't include the concept of germs or the importance of washing hands after handling waste. As a result, the Groom of the Stool, handling excrement daily without washing up afterward, was constantly exposed to the threat of disease, as was anyone else they were around. In an age where epidemics like the Black Death loomed large, this was not a small risk. Servants were often sickened by the very tasks that gave them reach to power. Additionally, the role wasn't confined to managing the royal latrine. The groom's responsibilities extended far beyond the physical task of removing waste. He had to ensure the king's cleanliness in an era where bathing was considered both an extravagance and a rare activity. Keeping the monarch hygienic and comfortable, especially when surrounded by filth, was crucial. This grim reality highlights just how revolting the role could be and how much trust the king placed in his servant. The Groom of the Stool had to be meticulous, as any sign of weakness or failure in this task could lead to a fall from grace, and as we'll see later, such falls could be deadly. The power of proximity, a seat at the king's table. The Groom of the Stool was initially established during the reign of Henry VII, and over the years it became one of the most prestigious positions in the royal court. It's hard to believe that a role that began with such degrading duties could transform into a position of true power. But by the time of Henry VIII, the Groom of the Stool had evolved into much more than a mere servant. This person wasn't just responsible for hygiene. They managed the king's personal schedule, finances, and had access to the most intimate and secret moments of the monarch's day. The groom's most infamous duty was assisting the king with his disgusting bathroom needs. Imagine the smell, the filth, the humiliation. Day after day, the groom had to clean up the king's excrement, handle his bodily fluids, and maintain the royal latrine. But this wasn't just physical labor. Every time the king sat upon his throne, no, not the golden one in the palace, but the wooden one in the privy, the groom was there. This intimate contact created a unique bond. The king came to trust the groom more than most of his courtiers. After all, who else shared such vulnerable moments? As a result of this intimacy, the groom of the stool often became more than just a servant. By the time of Henry VIII, the groom acted as a personal confidant, entrusted with some of the king's most sensitive matters. Sir Anthony Denny, one of the most notable grooms under Henry VIII, became a powerful political advisor. Denny was involved in critical decisions regarding the kingdom and even managed the king's finances, including overseeing payments and controlling access to royal treasuries. The position gave him access to the king in ways that others could only dream of. But power always comes with a price. The groom of the stool may have risen to prominence, but betrayal, rivalry, and the dangerous politics of the court constantly lurked in the shadows. Many who served the king too closely found themselves teetering on the edge of disaster. For every servant who managed to rise through the muck, there were many who fell victim to betrayal, ambition, or the unpredictable whims of the king. But what about those who used this disgusting job to secure their legacy? Filth to fortune, the legacy of royal servants. While some royal servants met a tragic end, others managed to turn the most revolting job in the kingdom into a pathway to unimaginable wealth and power. How did these men transform their dirty duties into lasting legacies? The story of the groom of the stool is not just one of degradation, it's also a tale of survival and ambition. Despite the filth, despite the risk of betrayal and risk to health, some grooms managed to secure their positions and elevate their families to new heights. By controlling the king's internal affairs, they became gatekeepers to royal favor, and with that came the immense power they had been chasing. As the groom of the stool's role expanded, so did their influence over royal finances. By the time of Henry VIII, the groom was responsible for managing the king's estates and finances, even controlling who could access the royal treasury. This made the groom one of the most powerful figures in the court. Sir Anthony Denny, for example, used his influence to amass land and wealth, securing his family's place in the aristocracy long after his service to the king had ended. But not every servant managed to achieve such a rise. For every Denny, there were countless others who failed to capitalize on their position. Many servants who started in these lowly roles remained trapped, their ambitions crushed by the brutal realities of court life. Only the shrewdest and the most calculating managed to survive the political games of the royal court, and for those who succeeded, the rewards were immense. By turning the dirtiest job into one of the most prestigious, these servants proved that even in a rigid society like medieval England, there was always a way to rise, if you were willing to pay the price. A dangerous game. Betrayal, torture, and the price of failure. In the cutthroat world of medieval politics, association to the king could be both a blessing and a curse. The price of failure in medieval courts wasn't just a loss of status, it could lead to brutal punishment. Those who succeeded, like Sir Anthony Denny under Henry VIII, rose to incredible heights, amassing wealth and power, but those who failed or were suspected of treason faced horrific consequences. For those who betrayed the king or fell out of favor, the consequences were far more gruesome. Betrayal was not taken lightly in medieval courts. Servants who were too ambitious or who overstepped their bounds risked torture or execution. One of the most feared methods of punishment was the rack, a gruesome device used to stretch the body, dislocating limbs and causing excruciating pain. It was often employed to extract confessions from those accused of plotting against the crown. Many servants accused of betraying the king or revealing sensitive information found themselves tied to the rack, their bodies stretched to the breaking point. Another common form of torture was the scavenger's daughter, a metal device that compressed the body, forcing the victim into an excruciating crouched position, causing internal bleeding and sometimes death. For those who failed in their roles or were suspected of betrayal, this could be their fate. In some cases, even if the servant was innocent, their favor with the king made them a target of rival factions within the court. Accusations of treason were a quick way to eliminate a competitor, and the consequences were often brutal. For servants who were deemed to have betrayed the king, execution wasn't just about death. It was a public spectacle meant to serve as a warning to others. The condemned might be drawn and quartered, their limbs pulled apart by horses or hanged in a public square. Even for those spared the most gruesome executions, there were still humiliating punishments, such as branding or exile. The line between loyalty and betrayal was razor thin, and one misstep could turn a trusted servant into a condemned traitor. For every servant who rose to power by cleaning filth, there were many others who met a darker fate. Loyalty in the medieval court was always precarious, and betrayal could come from any direction, often from those closest to the king. Imagine being one of the king's most trusted servants, only to be betrayed by your fellow courtiers, or worse, by the king himself. The closer you were to power, the more dangerous your position became. Dennis, Groom of the Stool to Henry VII, found this out the hard way. While he wielded incredible influence over royal appointments and finances, rumors swirled that some in the court resented his power. Jealous nobles were always ready to tear down anyone they saw as a threat. The politics of the royal court were ruthless, and trust was a fragile thing. The risk of betrayal didn't just come from the king's wrath. Fellow courtiers and nobles often played a dangerous game of politics, and a servant's closeness to the king made them a target. Rival factions within the court would stop at nothing to eliminate those who stood in their way, and many grooms of the stool were forced to navigate these treacherous waters. For some, the dangers outweighed the rewards, leading to their tragic and eventual downfall. In the reign of Henry VIII, the stakes became even higher. Sir Anthony Denny, despite his deep connection to the king, knew that his position was always fragile. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and his newly gained political power and influence could vanish overnight. In a court filled with ambitious nobles, betrayal was never far away. Many servants who gained the king's trust found themselves caught between warring factions. It was a constant game of endurance, and not everyone emerged unscathed. The risks didn't just come from fellow courtiers. The king's favor was notoriously fickle. One moment a servant might be the most trusted confidant. The next, they could be cast aside, or worse, executed for treason. Those who served the king too closely often found themselves in a dangerous balancing act where loyalty was demanded but never guaranteed in return. And when a king like Henry VIII turned against you, there was no escape from the axe. In the end, the story of royal servants like the Groom of the Stool is one of ambition and danger. For those willing to endure the filth, there was a chance to rise to the very heights of power. But for many, the path to influence was fraught with risk. Loyalty was never secure, and betrayal was always close at hand. In the end, those who served the king most intimately walked a fine line between power and punishment. For every servant who rose to power by cleaning up after the king, there were many others who fell, betrayed by their peers or caught in the crosshairs of royal politics. The medieval court was a world where power was constantly unpredictable, and those closest to the king often found themselves playing the most dangerous game of all. Survival. In this brutal world, trust was the rarest commodity, and the dirtiest jobs often came with the highest stakes. For us today, the story of these royal servants is a constant reminder that power is always within reach, but it often comes at a cost. Whether it's cleaning the filth of a king or navigating the treacherous politics of the court, the path to influence is never easy and rarely without danger. Join us again as we delve deeper into the shadows of history, exploring the lives of those who navigated the delicate balance between power and persistence in the most unexpected ways.